This is the Neurosurgery Podcast.
To write prescriptions is easy, but to come to an understanding with people is hard. That's Franz Kafka in a story called A Country Doctor. And so here, at the end of this march through the deadly sins in our work and in our lives, we come to the end, where we try to assemble the army of good, which is something you've been working at for many years.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call when you're actually out there in the arena and seeing what people are doing. And I'm not trying to indict other spine surgeons, but the public has lost a lot of confidence in us as spine surgeons. And neurosurgeons still have this patina of excellence, but it occurred to me about 10 years ago that we had to change things, that we had to organize our educational formats to allow for a value proposition that was quite different. And I've been very proud of our graduates. Our spine fellows are taught this from beginning, day one, of why this is so important. It's existential, literally.
Yeah, and I mean, at the outset of this series of conversations, and I think in each specific topic, we attempted to define good and evil. Mm-hmm. What is truly evil versus that which is just bad or undesirable? What is good and acceptable versus those opportunities for true heroism? And so, to be part of the army of good, to be one of the good guys, you have to know the difference between good and evil, which maybe isn't teachable. Mm-hmm. But even after that, you have to be able to recognize it in the real world. And then you have to pick a side, right? And it's one thing when you read a storybook or a fairy tale, it's very obvious which side to pick. Or when you watch Star Wars, mm-hmm. the guys in the black robes with the red swords, bad guys.
Yeah.
Right? The little green dude who says to be nice and get along, good guys.
Yeah.
Life is not Star Wars. We live in a very complex landscape where we have to do and we try to do things that are actually very simple. But as we've been talking about, doing something that is as simple as the right thing to do, that everyone knows is the right thing to do, is often very difficult and even obstructed by the environment, the ecosystem, the landscape that you're in. And so sometimes it can be hard to pick the right side because it's unclear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. How do you navigate that?
And I want to be clear. I don't want to suggest that there are good people and evil people.
Sure.
There's evil acts and there's acts of good. And there's gray areas and there's spectrum, right? Yeah. It's not black and white. But the army of good is based on a couple of framework propositions. One is that we are subscribing to a philosophy or a structure by which we see the universe. In other words, army of good is not we do a ton of whatevers, we make money with it, then we take that money and then we build an orphanage.
Right.
We're talking about the actual craft,
right,
which is spine surgery. Number two, we believe that spine surgery works, but that surgery is not to be utilized frivolously.
Right.
Right? Like war. And then the final piece of it is to understand that the best path to being an army of good is something along the lines of what Jordan Peterson talks about, which is competence. So in other words, the hardest thing to do, and we see this frequently play out in action movies, is the incompetent person has a very hard time being a hero. And incompetence is defined broadly. There's many ways to be incompetent. But you have to have the skill sets that allow you to have the free will. And so people often are placed in a situation, maybe again going back to Gooby and Doobie, right? Placed in a situation where your skill sets are not adequate.
Yeah.
And therefore your options are either to behave in ways that are semi-evil or eject. tap out. So in order to be able to perform in these environments, you have to be competent. So if someone says, well, we want you to do this, and you sense that that's not the right thing to do, you have to be willing to say, no, I'm not going to do that, but here's my alternate proposition to you.
Yeah.
That requires a lot of things: competence, self-confidence, a certain deterministic mindset that you can do that.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not as easy as just saying, I want to be a nice person, because it has nothing to do with being nice, per se.
Yeah. And I think that competence begets confidence. We talked about surgeons who avoid doing surgery because they don't feel capable of doing so. And that's maybe the wrong reason to make that decision, or at least it's not ideal. Ideally, you're able to do everything, and from that perspective, you can make the judgment, this patient doesn't need that. Not because I personally can't do it, but because that procedure isn't right for them.
And we have a giant advantage, giant advantage, as opposed to the priest class, which, you can say surgeon scientist, surgeon educator, surgeon priest, whatever. As opposed to the priest class, we're not dealing in a hypothetical world.
Right.
In other words, the results are immediately apparent.
Yes.
So as long as you are responsive and attentive to results, then you can see the end result of your action quite immediately.
Yeah.
And so that is a giant advantage, whereas priests don't necessarily, they're based on faith. We're not faith-based.
Yeah.
We're reality-based.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that is one of, if not the defining characteristic of the surgeon, is that we take action, right? I often think about and credit my co-resident Brad Kolb. We were talking one night about, I'm sure I'd had a few drinks and he probably had one, which is like equivalent levels for us. What makes a neurosurgeon? What is the distinguishing characteristic of a neurosurgeon? Mm-hmm. And he said, it's the ability to make an incredibly high stakes decision with very little information at 2 a.m.
That's exactly right.
That's who we are.
He's exactly right.
Right. And so...
And those actions have consequences.
Yes, very high stakes. Extraordinarily high stakes, extraordinarily little information, and it's 2 a.m. and you just woke up and you just decide. And then I would go further. It's not just enough to make the decision, but then you enact the decision, because we are surgeons and we do things. And so if you keep walking this little process of joining and participating in the army of good, you have to believe in good and evil. And you have to believe in free will to believe in good and evil. You have to recognize good and evil when you see it in the world. You have to pick the side and sign up to be in the army of good. And then you have to do something about it, right? You have to actually take action. And that doesn't just mean, I'm a neurosurgeon, I do neurosurgery. That means not doing bad, actively doing good, speaking up when you see wrong happening, telling the truth. You have to take action in this world for the good and against the evil.
Exactly.
Which, again, it sounds at face value like, oh, we're surgeons, of course. We do stuff. We're people that do stuff. There are shades of gray, and there are ways within the world of neurosurgery to kind of passively skate by and just keep your head down, do your job, not push for the good. Exactly.
And there are roles for those individuals as well, right?
Yeah.
But especially at the tip of the spear, which is spine surgery, this is really something I plead with listeners to pay attention to. Now, let me just add another caveat, which is, of course, I have plenty of untoward outcomes. I have a lot of patients who are not doing well, who didn't have the outcome I wanted, who I could have made a different decision in retrospect that may have changed the outcome. I have a lot of fair outcomes, and I have a lot of great outcomes, right? So I'm on this journey, like you said, like a pilgrimage, pilgrim, like everybody else. I'm not the holder of the knowledge, right? But we are in the pursuit of this form of clarity, because there is so little of it nowadays. And you hear it from Ed Benzel, you hear it from Dan Resnick, you hear it from people, and it's people seek to teach it, but they don't teach it explicitly.
Yeah.
anymore. This is an unfortunate thing. This evidence-based medicine drive, this idea that we can just reduce everything to numbers and statistics and randomized controlled trials, unfortunately, it is going to be found wanting.
Yeah, if there's not a p-value, if there's not a citation for it, we seem to have decided that absence of evidence is evidence of absence.
Right.
When you have generations and generations of, I'll just say it, wise elders
Right.
who say, in all of our combined experience, passed down from my mentors to me and now from me to you, this is good, this is bad.
Right.
Things that cannot be tested scientifically, questions that shouldn't even be asked with the scientific method because they're not scientific questions. And so you talk about the outcomes that you have in your career, but there's more than our clinical outcomes and our patient outcomes. There are these internal moments where we fall short. There are moments where even if we don't do bad, we miss, as we talked about, that opportunity to overcome just good, an opportunity for heroism that we don't hear the call, or we hear it and we're sloths and we don't rise to the occasion. And we've talked a lot about failure in the different sins we've covered and the ways that those sins can consume us, but we haven't talked about what comes next. We talked about some self-directed anger and wrath, but, tangent. When I met you at University of Miami Medical School, I came to your office. I said, I want to work with you, Dr. Wang.
Remember the day.
It was right before Thanksgiving.
Yep.
And you said, go home and talk to your dad. See if you're really ready for this. Figure out what you want to do. And when we decided to do this podcast series about good and evil, I talked to my dad. And I said, Dad, this is, sometimes I tell him, maybe once a quarter, I say, hey, you might be interested in that episode. It's about something that, he's an attorney. Most of what we talk about doesn't really apply to him and wouldn't make sense to him. But I said, Dad, you're going to love this. We're doing a series about good and evil. I made a little outline for the episodes we're going to do. I sent it to him, and he read through it, and he said, this is great, really interested, can't wait to hear this. It's exciting that you're doing it. But you know what you didn't mention anywhere? I said, what? It's 7 deadly sins. I got the list off Wikipedia. I didn't miss anything, right? And he goes, you didn't talk about guilt. And peppered through all of these, we've talked about how the sins can consume us, those bad motivations. We've talked about failure. We've talked about falling short. And with envy, we talked about that resentment or admiration, the chronic phase of that bad drive. But we haven't really talked about the chronic phase of failure. And so, for potential recruits to the Army of Good, who have seen an evil in the world, found a dragon to slay, and even tried to do it. So not just that you didn't go to bat for good, but you took a swing and missed. Boy, do I have a collection of missed swings that still weigh on my conscience. And the guilt that we can carry because of the nature of our work, and then add on top of that the guilt in failed relationships, letting down a partner, children, siblings, friends, the things that we sacrifice to our work and feel guilty about. It's a cliche, oh, you miss weddings when you're in residency, right? That guilt can really build up. How do you manage those times that you take the swing and miss?
So let me just add that I don't feel that there are very few people that are pure, that are evil. Okay? Very few people. The acts are evil. People frequently commit evil acts. I myself have. We all have. The key is the balance. What can you do? So there's this concept that is very prevalent today about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a new phenomenon arising that people are paying attention to that's more relevant to this discussion, which is about post-traumatic growth disorder. And so if you think about the nervous system, for adaptation and survival, anytime one is exposed to stress, trauma, the nervous system is going to pay great attention to that to understand it and better appreciate how to avoid further trauma and potentially death, right?
Yeah.
So what's the difference between a person who's exposed to trauma that gets PTSD versus a person who gets post-traumatic growth disorder? Okay, this is a very important part about this guilt piece. Guilt is a more minor form of this. So if you think about it, I was asking Amy, my wife, coming back from World War II, it didn't seem like a ton of people, meaning a preponderance of people, were getting PTSD.
Yeah.
But Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, tons of it. Now, why is this? Now, there's a lot of theories, and they're all probably semi-relevant. But this framework allows us to appreciate better that if your internal moral compass and your moral view of the world is aligned with what your actions are in a time of trauma, you're less likely to have trauma from it and more likely growth. So for example, let's say I'm asked to go to war tomorrow, and I go to country X, and I'm a sociopath. I love burning cats and, torturing dogs and putting salt on slugs.
You're
And
the comedian in Watchmen.
yeah.
You're just living for it.
So then they say, listen, you're going to go to this village, you're going to kill a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
I kill a bunch of kids, I probably won't get PTSD
Right.
because it's aligned with my value system.
Yeah.
Now, if I don't feel that way and I'm a normal person, I will come back with PTSD. So the most important thing for a surgeon, because we are exposed to daily traumas in a way, they're not on our bodies per se. Sometimes they are, but mostly they're on other people's bodies.
Yeah.
Right? It's the classic the drone pilot syndrome.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you're aligned with your value system, you won't get PTSD. So do I have bad outcomes? Yes. Do I have PTSD? Not so much, because those processes happen. I was very much affected, and the patient even more, but the value system was aligned. I knew why I did the surgery. The patient knew why I did it. This is very unfortunate. It's the natural evil versus, I really should have done something else, and I really kind of planned to do that, but I chose this other path for the wrong reason. Greed, right?
Yeah.
Sloth, right? Wrath, whatever you pick, right? Lust. And now I've created a scenario where I get PTSD, meaning burnout. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
But if I always make my decisions aligned with my personal philosophy, so this opens it up for the sociopaths. I'm going to say that very openly because we're neuroscientists. We're not talking about policy. We're talking neuroscience. Wow. Sociopaths, they got a free license. That's why we need the trial attorneys. But the reality is, if you make your choices and actions aligned that way, your likelihood of burnout is actually pretty low.
Yeah, and I guess you could create a theoretical worst case scenario where you're doing an unindicated surgery because you want to make more money to achieve the things that all your friends have and get your face on a billboard and be able to buy some hot woman to take home, and you stayed up till 2 a.m. drinking the night before, and so now you're really tired and you're rushing because you just want to get home and do some cocaine, and you paralyze someone.
Right. And normally you don't, so you get away with it.
Right.
That's the norm.
But then that horrible outcome happens. But you're not a sociopath.
Right.
You're just well down the road of self-indulgent behavior.
Yeah.
And then the complication happens and you paralyze someone in the setting of a surgery they didn't need for all the wrong reasons. Ouch. Versus earlier this year, I had a patient that I participated in surgery for. I was not my patient, but I have strong ownership for this, that died during surgery. It was a trauma, it was a subdural, and what I was able to tell myself honestly after this event, and which is exactly what I said to this person's wife immediately after it happened, was everything possible that we could have done, we did for him well. And there was nothing we could have done that wasn't done. And there was nothing bad that we did. We did everything possible. We're not gods. We did everything that we could. And if you know in your heart that you attempted to do the right thing and executed it well and still have that horrible outcome, you're not going to have PTSD. And I'm sad about it. I still think about it. It's horrible. But my conscience is clear because I know in my bones we did everything right. We didn't do anything wrong. That's all that's within our power.
Yep. That's the natural evil versus the moral evil.
Right. Exactly. That's really, really bad.
Yes.
But no one did anything evil. Right.
But the problem is you don't always have that clarity. Like in this
Right.
particular case, you do. There's always something like, well, I should have, I could have, I
Yeah.
would have. And shoulda, coulda, woulda is always in the mind of the great surgeons because, yeah, you want to play it again, different scenario, different circumstances, and that will eventually get to you. That's why you need the win-loss matrix,
Yeah.
right? Because there are those cases.
Yeah, but there is only one history of our lives, and
Right.
and you can learn from that for the next roll of the dice, but it's a different person, and it's a different case. Every time I have verbal, you could almost call it a tics, but if I'm in surgery and someone says the word should, like, oh, that should work, or like, oh, they should be okay, I say, to live in should land, where the home team always wins and the bad guys get what's coming.
That's right.
Should. Oh, great. Should. No, that's like we were talking before, and I just wrote a ranting, I guess you'd call it, essay on Twitter about it's better to be lucky than good.
Yeah.
Hate it, because that is should language.
Yeah.
And what I said in that is that lucky is something that happens to you, maybe, but good is something that you decide to be, or you don't, right? And so now, talking to the fresh recruits, our army of zealots for good, the only way forward after a failure and the only way out of guilt is ahead, and to persevere and to stay committed to the cause you believed in that got you that far. Even when you trip and fall, you get back up and you keep marching. You have been committed for decades, and you are recruiting people to this army who hopefully you're lighting their fire to keep going.
That's why we need a community. That's why we get together. That's why people listen to this podcast. The idea being that there are all of the externalities of what happens to us as a result of this grueling but incredibly rewarding life. To live it alone in isolation is difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
That's why we go to meetings. That's why we hang out with our friends. That's why we talk about these things. We are humans. We sit around the campfire. We tell the stories. Telling stories has a healing property, whether it's for guilt or for affirmation or for learning. And that's really what this is all about. So, Army of Good, we're recruiting.
Yeah.
We know you're out there. It's the bulk of us, right? Commitment to that.
And it's a call for action. And again, surgeons are by nature people who take action and
Right.
who act, but that doesn't mean that there is not fear, especially in the early days.
There's fear every day. I
right.
have fear every day.
Yeah, and I don't know who said it, but courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the face of it.
Correct.
Or I found this Dostoevsky quote: "Man has it all in his hands, and it slips through his fingers from sheer cowardice." Right? There is no such thing as the absence of fear, whether you're stressed during a microdisc because of what could go wrong, or you have 3 cases in a row. Let's say you have 3 microdiscs in a row, and you just got a leak in the first one. Now you got to wheel another person back, and you're just thinking, "Oh God, oh God, oh God!" Right? You got to take action, whether or not you feel afraid, whether or not there is inherent risk to what you're doing. The risk of inaction is so often greater, and especially in the conflict of good and evil.
Exactly. Well put, JP. Well, thank you for doing this. It's been an amazing time with you.
Thank
you
you.
for coming to Miami.
And thank you to all watching, I hope, and listening. This has been a new direction we've embarked with the show, launching our new website, neurosurgerypodcast.com. You can reach us there. You can reach us at neurosurgerypodcast@gmail.com. And you can reach us on X at Neurosurgery Podcast, where I think that's where we're most active now for social media. I hope this is
Send us
meant
your
something
comments.
to you.
Send comments.
Send us your comments, your questions, and your enlistment in the Army of Good.